Impact Measurement Program. I'll be joined by Nicholls, who I'll introduce shortly. We're thrilled to see so many of you participating in today's webinar, and we'll just let a few more people in, and then we'll get started. This is our first webinar of the year on impact measurement, and many of you have been following us throughout our series on impact investing and social finance, so we're thrilled to see both several of you who are familiar to us and many who are new to us. This is obviously a topic that's gaining a lot of interest these days, and so we're thrilled to be able to share some of our reflections based on our research, teaching, and what we're observing from the field with you today. So just on the next slide, as I said, I'll be joined here today by Nicholls, who I lead the impact measurement program with. Alex also leads the impact investing and social finance programs, and he is a professor here at the business school and brings a wealth of knowledge around research. And he'll be talking about some of the themes that he's been observing as well. Both of us started this program a few years ago to really try and provide a bit more clarity on the kinds of themes, issues, practices, critical perspectives on impact measurement. As it turns out that many of these questions are being asked much more visibly and strongly today. We're going to touch on some of these. In a sense, we're also going to give you a bit of a peek into the kinds of things we talk about in the program and introduce you to some of the ways in which we frame how we answer these questions and themes. So just on the next slide, our agenda for today, we're going to just open up with a bit of context on measurement. We're going to then pick up on 4 themes that we see come up most strongly in some of our work, as well as in the questions that many of you have already submitted. So we'll pick up each of these and talk about where we think we are and what we're learning, and maybe provide some provocative thoughts around the state of play and maybe where we're going. And then we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. Please submit your questions to us using the Q&A function. Many of you graciously submitted questions in advance, so we're going to try and pick those up as we go. Here are some of the themes that came up in addition to the 4 themes that we'll cover, including aligning impact and finance reporting, lots of questions around additionality and what that might look like, questions around best models, practices, and standards, which we'll touch on, as well as sector-level data and other themes. If you're interested, we cover some of these themes also in previous webinars, and so when we send out the recording, we'll be able to direct you to some of those webinars as well. So just moving on to situate and provide a bit of context around impact measurement. This is the way that we define impact in the program. We talk about material changes. These could be positive or negative. We often want to understand the temporal dimensions over a long term on both people, planet, as well as on systems. These effects may be intended or unintended. And then to pick up on the additionality question, beyond what would have otherwise been expected to occur, there's a number of ways that gets interpreted in practice. Some themes that we emphasize throughout the program, that measurement is really not just a technical exercise, but is also a strategic and leadership imperative. And many of the questions we get asked around measurement almost have a framing around, just give me the 5 steps or tell me what to do. And as you'll see later on, we try and unpack the frames, the mental models, and the approaches to be able to help you ask the right questions in the right order. And this is quite important because we're trying to integrate different perspectives from multiple stakeholders, not all of whom see these issues in the same way, nor of whom would agree on issues around what gets measured, how it gets measured, and who's doing the measuring. We also talk a lot about in the program the balancing act between measuring, managing, and maximizing impact, and that measurement should be helpful to look forward as well as to understand what happened. So in that framing, the choices you make, the constraints you operate within, and the context that you and your stakeholders are engaging in all matter in terms of what measurement looks like in practice. We talk about many of these issues in one of the articles that Alex and I co-authored, and you can find the link just on the next slide, where we describe in a bit more detail the ways in which we think about these issues, both around measurement as well as around the ways in which it matters for different stakeholders. And so just on this slide, you'll see that there are a few themes that I've already discussed. If you want a bit more information, you can visit the link below. And I think one more additional point is that thinking about the way that you frame impact and measurement describes the way that you might think about what is valued. But as we'll pick up on the questions around standards and monetization, what we're trying to really bring together in impact measurement is what is this combination of principles, approaches, processes, ways of thinking to allow for more informed judgments and to ask some of the critical questions of the why, what, and how. Speaking of the critical framework that we use in the course, we run through each of these components over the 5 days, or now in the virtual version, 5 weeks. We start by asking questions around why we measure. Then we move on to what we measure as well as how. And in between, we ask questions around also who measures and when to measure. And then we also pick up on how we make decisions and the kinds of decisions around acting and using information. And so each of the 4 or 5 weeks picks up on framing impact, multiple perspectives on impact. We then pick up on approaches as well as decisions. If you're interested in more information on the program, the link is below. And Annabelle will wrap up at the end. You can always contact her if you'd like more information about the program. We're now on a waiting list for the June program, but please reach out if you like any information. So that's the very short, brief introduction to the program, as well as to some of the framing issues around impact. We want to get into the substance around some of the themes. And so I'll hand it over to Alex now to introduce us to our first theme, monetization.
Thank you, Karim, and welcome everybody. It's wonderfully exciting to have so many people engaging with us today. I mean, I've been around this space a long time, probably longer than Karim, because I'm a bit grayer than he is, but let's say 15 years or so. And I have to say that if we'd run this kind of webinar 15 years ago, we'd have got almost nobody attending. So the kind of acceleration in interest and of course the importance and validity of this area of work is really, really exciting. And I think looking forward to the world we have to live in post-COVID and even the current challenges we have, understanding and measuring and managing the impact of all kinds of investment in organizations has never been more important. So we find this stuff really exciting, and I hope you do as well. So I'm going to talk to you about 2 of the holy grails of this field. One is monetization, the other are standards. And both of these have their logic in financial accounting, really. And when we look back at the history of financial accounting and how it evolved at the early part of the 20th century, we can see a movement away from a kind of wild west of data where people couldn't really understand what was a good or bad investment or a safe or dangerous investment, through a process of institutionalization around sustainability standards and accounting frameworks. And I think in many ways we're in that same wild west now in impact, and we're trying to find a way to create consistent frameworks of reporting, accounting and managing for this stuff. And within that logic, at least based on financial accounting, putting a monetary value on impact has for a long time been a kind of major objective. And the attractiveness of this is simply that if you can monetize impact, then you could potentially integrate it in existing financial accounting mechanisms and frameworks alongside the conventional measures of performance given a dollar or yen or pound or euro value. So where does this all begin? Well, I'm just going to talk very quickly about 2 or 3 things that are interesting. This goes back a long way. Social return on investment, SROI, is really where this begins. It begins in the late 90s in the United States with the Roberts Enterprise Development Foundation beginning to find a way to put a monetary price on impact using proxies. So for example, you might look at employment statistics, getting people into work through a program, having a value in that it increases their income, increases government taxes, and also reduces the cost of welfare for those people who would otherwise be unemployed. So you could put a monetary value on that employment program, for example. And then they would find a way to discount that and then compare that impact against the costs of the program. That would give them a ratio. And that was the beginning of SROI thinking. It has, however, developed a long way since then. This is a kind of canonical guide. It's nearly 10 years old now, but it's still available on the web, and it's a kind of classical guide to how to do this. Increasingly, on the left, you'll see here, the SRI project has been broadened out from a simple monetization project towards a stakeholder engagement project, one that recognizes the importance of stakeholder voice in establishing what's material and important, and also not overclaiming the importance, and a number of other things you can see here. So whilst the heart of this still remains a monetization project, literally a return on investment with social as a central focus, not financial, they've now increased the kind of scope of this to have a whole number of other empowerment and other criteria of action around SROI. But it remains kind of the first and canonical example. It's used by many organizations, and you may indeed be using it yourself if you do this kind of work already. But much more recently, we've had a project called the Impact Multiple of Money project coming out of Harvard Business School predominantly, which is trying to do the same thing, really. It's updating SROI across these dimensions of analysis. And I won't go through them all, but essentially it begins with the scoping exercise. So let's imagine, again, you have to locate an investment or a project or organization in a sector. So what's the relevance and scope of that intervention? How does it fit against others? And then a series of steps to identify monetization variables, essentially. So specify your outcomes clearly, and then look for proxies, essentially, in comparable data sets. So somebody who's done that thing before, education, health, carbon reduction, what price has been put on it, essentially, and how could you use that as a proxy? But then you've got to adjust for the risk. So how likely is it that that proxy you're borrowing is appropriate for you? You might have to discount it in some way or make an adjustment, and their analysis takes through all of that. And then you'll be able to work out some kind of terminal data. You might include some kind of discount rate, which you might take, for example, from the price of government bonds. That's very low at the moment. There's some broad comparator for a kind of social deduction through an NPV model. And then you can do the same thing as with SROI. You can work out the cost of an intervention and then some kind of impact value, and work out a return on the dollar you spend. So this is a kind of update of SROI, but it has its roots in that thinking. And among other places, you can go and see an HBR piece that sets this all out. And there's the example article, and you can download that from the web for free. That is then linked to another project, also at Harvard, taking that kind of thinking and putting it into accounting. So impact-weighted accounts, as they're called. It's a project you can see here, and it's trying to take the logics of the impact-weighted calculations into an accounting framework. So actually beginning to integrate those with financial accounting. And again, you can go to their website and see their principles are around transformation, and based on the principle, impact can be measured and compared. Very important insight. Many people think, oh, I can't measure impact, it's too difficult. No, it can always be measured in some form. And then they're trying to create this new model. Some of you asked about sector-specific data or methods or variables. Well, again, if you go to their website, you can find already, it's probably hard for you to read, there's a number of sector analyses, the airline industry, employment, finance, packaging, retail. They've already done a kind of sector analysis using their model of impact-weighted accounting to try to show you how you might apply that to a given sector. It's not a complete set, but they've done a number of great pieces of work. So that's another sort of iteration of the original SROI idea. Just a couple of other outliers or other different ways of thinking about this. One is impact bonds. Our colleagues in the Blavatnik School at Oxford and the Government Outcomes Lab have done amazing work, again, this is their website, looking at how impact bonds, which some of you will be familiar with as social impact bonds or development impact bonds, effectively monetize impact. And they have to do that because the contracts that you specify in an impact bond typically provide some kind of value of an outcome such that it can then be compared with an investment and an outcomes payment appropriate to the value, however calculated, of that particular impact. That could again be, addressing homelessness, getting girls into education, improving water quality, lots of different variables. So it's not based on the same principles as the Harvard work, but it does give an outcomes measure in money, which is also very interesting. Here is from their data set they have on their website, just a snapshot of impact bonds. Currently 204 live globally. You can see the numbers and you can see the countries where impact bonds are up and running or under development right now. So it is a global phenomenon, but also please note predominantly in Europe right now. 165 out of 204 are European based, but it's also elsewhere. And the final one, just another outline, another kind of Oxford plug, Kate Rayworth's work on the donut economy. Her whole view here is that we have to rethink the value of all capital, as natural capital, social capital, as well as financial capital in the context of a donut, which suggests we have boundaries for each of those sets of capitals beyond which we cannot go. And so this is a kind of a much larger scale, macro scale conceptualization of how we somehow value relatively lots of different types of capital and then make strategic judgments about, among other things, how we might save the planet. So that's a monetization models. Again, just a brief overview. The second holy grail is then having standards. Standards allow us again to build accounting frameworks is the principle here. Now, currently there's a lot of noise around this. So you can see here on the left-hand side, these are all different initiatives that in different ways are trying to calculate or present standards, typically around sustainability with a strong climate focus, but also sometimes with a social lens as well. Effectively competing, working at different levels of analysis, different standards, different measures, different requirements of reporting and so forth. None of them based in regulation, all of them voluntary to some degree. From The Economist last week, you just see on the right-hand side how some of these are being adopted by S&P 500 companies. And you can see the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, is at the top of those, but others have been growing, such as SASB, very rapidly over the last 8 years or so in terms of adoption by S&P companies. So this stuff is very live with the S&P and other interest groups. Perhaps, as you can see, the focus here is more on standard corporations and investments rather than perhaps social enterprises that we might have explored more with the SROI model. But this is nevertheless a big agenda. So within this, there's something called the Impact Management Project, IMP, which began really looking at how we could create standards of impact reporting and measurement for impact investing specifically, which is investments into impact companies, specifically not mainstream companies typically. And they've shifted their focus now much more to being on understanding sustainability. So in this sense, they're moving towards that consensus building around the noise we saw in the previous slide. And they're being instrumental, I think, in trying to bring a consensus. Essentially, can we get all those competing standards to agree some commonality that could, in the end, be some formal framework that everybody could adopt, at least in this sustainability broadly defined space. So this is another plug for Oxford. We have something called Leadership in Extraordinary Times in the right-hand corner, LIT. That's the web link. You can see an interesting discussion exactly on this question of aligning sustainability standards with some of the key players in the field, chaired by my colleague Richard Barker, Professor of Accounting at the Business School. So if you want to see more about some of this stuff, there's a nice website, so you can go and click on through and see this discussion, about an hour's discussion. But of course, all of this has some problems. And indeed, now there's beginning to be a bit of a backlash about how some of these standards may end up being greenwashing. And there's been a bit of backlash around BlackRock's positioning on this particularly. Here's Sandra Boss, who's their new-ish head of global, head of investment stewardship, as her role is called. She's actually in that webinar or that panel talk I just mentioned earlier. And I think she brings out in that conversation very clearly how people like BlackRock, which is the biggest asset manager in the world, is materially trying to position themselves or move their position away from perhaps more tokenistic accounts of their concern about particularly climate into more substantive ones. But interestingly, because of some of this noise in the US, the SEC has announced an enforcement task force just very recently, earlier this month, focused on climate and ESG issues. So there's a concern now that as these kind of standards begin to emerge, it creates an opportunity for all kinds of, let's say, greenwashing, to put it kindly. And the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, is now beginning to look seriously about whether this could be an area where, quite frankly, there could be fraud. And therefore, it's going to be of great interest to them to think about regulation or at least enforcement. And finally, just a couple of examples of actual legislation and regulation. So within the European Union, there is now a non-financial reporting directive, which is regulated law in the EU. The companies over a certain level, I think it's 50 employees, now have to report on a number of these issues: environmental protection, social responsibility, human rights, and so on. You can see them at the bottom of the slide. So this is now a requirement. It has been a requirement for a couple of years, but they've reviewed it this year, and I think they're going to give it a more enforceable value as a regulated approach to trying to force companies, well, require them to report publicly on their sustainability as part of this movement towards, I guess, a standardized common approach. And finally, the IFRS, which is one of the two major standard setters for financial accounting, has last year announced a consultation paper on new standards of reporting to set up a sustainability standards board to run alongside the financial standards board within this framework for reporting. And only yesterday, they announced that they're going to create a working group specifically to advance this agenda to accelerate convergence on these standards and potentially set up a sustainability standards board within their structure that would begin to require at least consistency, if not regulatory disclosure around this stuff. So things are moving very fast. It's likely something will be announced at the COP meeting at the end of the year in Britain about this project. So it's really right at the cutting edge. So those are the two things I will talk to, and now we move to Karim.
Great, thanks, Alex. See, we've already got a lot of good questions, so we'll pick those up very shortly. I'm going to introduce two more themes, and just as a quick note, we'll be sharing the presentation with all of you and the recording of the webinar within the week. So please keep your questions coming, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can over the next little while. So I'm going to start with just looking at the influence of technology on impact measurement. And this is happening in a number of different ways. On one hand, we're beginning to see different forms of the big data. I mean, we all know this term. And then Internet of Things, the use of sensors to be able to collect different kinds of data, paired up with what probably many of us are familiar with, the use of ICT technologies to be able to primarily make data collection more efficient. Now, when you begin to combine big data and IoT, you begin to then have advantages that perhaps we didn't have before as we think about what it means to measure, how to measure, and what kind of data is used to think about patterns and making new kinds of data as well more visible than it otherwise would be. So one set of examples is when you introduce these different forms of collecting data, the different methodologies and tools, et cetera. On one hand, you're able to get access to data we wouldn't otherwise get access to. You also get the ability to triangulate different kinds of data in ways that we wouldn't normally be able to do in a cost-efficient way. And then interestingly, we also get a lot of questions around, well, what if we have too much data? Which data is actually material or matters for the kinds of outcomes and issues that we're trying to unpack? And not surprisingly, raises a lot of questions around privacy, particularly when you're working with vulnerable populations. So I think there's both upside and downside, and I've included some references with each of these slides. For those of you that are interested with a bit more information, please visit some of these references. So what does this really look like in practice? On the next slide, here's one set of examples that come from 60 decibels. Many of you are probably familiar with their work, really looking at how to hear and listen from frontline customers, users in a number of different ways. This is an excerpt from some work they just did over the last year around the ways in which COVID has affected different groups. This example is from farmers, and you can see how they're able to do longitudinal analysis to be able to understand both subjective and objective data points. And this is what's quite powerful, is that you're able to now, with the use of technologies, including SMS and others, to be able to track data over time to look at both objective data points as well as perception-based data. But practically, if we get data more accessibly, with a shorter feedback loop, we're able to react and respond more quickly to what we're finding. And this really is an attempt to try and get beyond some of the classic challenges of measurement, that it happens too late to be able to respond in any substantial way. A lot of the newer technologies are allowing us to understand real-time insights in ways that triangulate data to be able to give us a fuller picture of what is happening, and then to also understand how are people responding to the various interventions that are being put in place. And so here you can also see different examples of how farmers in particular are having to draw on savings, borrowing, or selling assets. And you can begin to then anticipate, what would be the right kind of intervention strategy if you were trying to intervene either with grants or investments or a combination. On the next slide, this begins to raise a really important set of issues around when we have a lot of data, what do we know about the data? Heather Krause from weallcount.com has this idea or theme of a data biography that increasingly, as we have more and more data, we have to ask who collects the data, who owns the data, where is data stored, why was it collected, what are the critical aspects of how it's being used, and is it being used, for example, in ways that it wasn't intended for? The other thing that we're seeing with more sophisticated models, particularly when we combine big data, AI, and blockchain, there are a ton of really interesting innovations that we won't be able to cover in this presentation, but we also have to ask a different set of questions than we might have before. Who's constructing the models? What are the different parts of these models really look like? There's a lot happening, for example, around asking questions around bias. How is bias being embedded within certain kinds of models in ways that might be counter to the kinds of things that you're looking to do in terms of the intended outcomes for different groups? Many of us are familiar with theory of change, and we use that to question our assumptions, but we don't always have formal processes to be able to look at data models, the ways in which data is being analyzed and combined to try and understand what assumptions are being embedded in these ways of working. And so these are a new set of issues that we're only beginning to explore, but it's where we need much more critical analysis rather than just assuming all data is good or objective or has value. So on the next slide, here are some other examples as we think about what this is looking like in the corporate sector. Increasingly, there's a lot of demand for non-financial information, building on what Alex has noted earlier, around non-financial types of data that are material for different kinds of corporates, including within supply chains. Here are some examples for some groups that I've been working with through the Working Capital Supply Chain Innovation Fund. On the left-hand side, Provenance provides traceability solutions from origin across the kind of life cycle and journey to the customer. So you can really trace back and say, where is my product coming from and what happened along the way. Ulula is another interesting example around how to look at feedback mechanisms from workers. So if workers have grievances, how do you actually hear from them, take their grievances seriously, and do it in a manner that provides some protection and confidentiality so that vulnerable workers are not further exploited within supply chains. Supply Shift provides interesting data around how suppliers in particular maybe are adhering to or not good corporate practices. And when you begin to think about providing in all of these cases visibility to kinds of data that was otherwise either not visible or not reliable, you begin to get some very powerful effects on the kinds of decisions that are being made, but also really important questions on what type of data is actually useful, material, relevant as we think about decision making. If anything, the last year has really taught us that non-financial factors and data matter. We're seeing this reflected from investors, from corporates, and many other parts of society. And as Alex has noted, regulation is slowly catching up to many of these kinds of issues. But in some case, technology has leapt far beyond where regulation is today. And to bridge that chasm is going to take a little bit of time, but it's happening quite quickly. What's needed, just on the next slide, is that as we deal with different kinds of data, a bit of data overload, a lot of dashboards, it's not clear whether we're using all this data to actually make better decisions, different decisions. Are we just validating what we already know? And who actually has the power to make some of these decisions? And is that changing? If workers have more grievances, how do we actually know that not only we hear those, but those are responded to in different ways than it might have a year ago? These are, I think, some of the outstanding questions. But again, we're seeing technology provide some pathways around how these solutions could be addressed. This on the next slide raises a set of issues that Alex has already touched on, that we're beginning to see much more of virtually across every sector in which impact measurement is happening. Impact integrity or impact washing. There's a set of issues now around overclaiming impact, ignoring negative impacts, maybe downplaying certain kinds of impacts and overplaying other kinds of impacts. This, maybe a year or two ago, this was a set of issues we thought would happen. Well, it's here now. And if you look at the headlines in the last 3 to 6 months, you see this in many different forms. Alex touched on some of those earlier. It's everything from looking at how funds claim evidence of impact through to online calculators. Many of you have probably seen some versions of these to look at, for every dollar or $100 or £100 of your investment, you are generating X amounts of impact or units of impact, whether it's employment, tons of CO2, etc. And as Alex noted earlier, a lot of hard questions around ESG, sustainable investing, and also a bit of a pushback around from the industry around what this all really means. If we think about this practically, the record inflows around ESG are raising serious questions. And I think that those will continue. At the same time, there's lots more products that are seeking that kind of customer demand. This raises a set of questions that many of you have also pointed out and sent to us in advance on the next slide around some of the differences between alignment, contribution, as well as additionality. And so we'll pick up on these in the next few slides as well as a discussion with Alex and I. We're all probably familiar with this term alignment. We hear this all the time, particularly in the context of the SDGs and increasingly in the Paris agreements and the Paris goals. You can see here from this visual that came from some documents from 2 Degrees Investing that look at distinguishing between contribution and alignment, and basically saying that those are not the same thing. We see this in impact investing a lot, and this question, particularly around what investor contribution is. The impact management project that Alex mentioned earlier has the ABC framework that they talk about the investor contribution as well as the enterprise contribution. And those are some helpful starting points. It's very clear that we need to go beyond that to be much more sophisticated in how we think about what contribution could or should look like, because the distinctions between how we operate in public markets versus private markets and the role of measurement in each of these contexts isn't simply a measurement question. It's a governance question, it's a leadership question, and frankly, it's also a regulatory question. And so we're just beginning to see these issues come up in a more substantive way. And Alex and I will pick up on this shortly when we get to the questions. Just the final slide on this theme is that many of these kinds of issues of impact integrity, impact washing, as well as alignment, contribution, and additionality have prompted a very early emergent industry around what is being called either impact verification or assurance or audit. On one hand, you see practice-based standards. You also have principles. And so 2 of these examples come from the IFC's operating principles for impact management, NPC's impact assurance framework. And then we've also had in the past lots of good examples from groups like Keystone and Feedback Labs around how do you close feedback loops with communities in order to ensure that they're the ones that are helping you account for whether impact occurred or not. And then increasingly, a new set of actors, including Bluemark, Tideline, and others such as KPMG, Deloitte, who are also beginning to develop and adapt frameworks from classic assurance and audit and adapt those for impact reporting and management. Now, there are lots of questions and perhaps concerns around how many of these frameworks and tools are being developed and applied. In some cases, they are perhaps not fit for purpose. In other cases, they might be entrenching the kinds of power dynamics that we see in financial markets that are perhaps counter to some of the goals we might have at a systems level. In other cases, they're very helpful starting points to just get us to begin to provide more transparency and robustness and thoughtfulness around how we interpret these issues. So in the spirit of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, we still need to be able to ask some of these critical questions around what is being verified, who verifies, and to what extent are these issues around verification really going to play out in intended and unintended ways to support the larger goals of systems change that I think we're all hoping to see in this post-COVID era. So we've given you a lot of different themes and content that covered the kinds of things that we normally teach, research, and see. Hopefully we've given you some provocations and food for thought. There's a lot of good questions that have come in. And so maybe I'll ask Alex to jump in to see if there's any initial responses to some of the questions that we've seen come in so far, and the new ones as well. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion with you. Please keep those questions coming in. Alex, you might still be on mute.
Sorry about that. Well, I don't know where to begin. Should we begin at the beginning? We seem to have about 8 or 9 questions put in the Q&A. Okay, so let's start with Gideon. Isn't it the problem with attaching a monetary value to things like sustainability? It then becomes a valid trade-off. So the question here for Gideon is what about trade-off? Well, it's a great question, Gideon. I think my first blush response would be potentially, but not necessarily, and it would depend on on a number of issues. For example, your investors. So you will have seen last week that Danone sacked its CEO, Emmanuel Faber, because he was apparently placing too big an emphasis on social and environmental factors in the way he was running Danone. So in that situation, trying to bring those issues into the corporate context of accounting for their performance was very negative for him. And that was a very unusual situation in France to have activists, equity holders actually ousting a CEO. But I mean, there's many benefits in monetizing it because, as we've said, it allows consistency. It allows you, for example, to track your performance over time in a consistent fashion. It allows you perhaps over time to compare your performance with others who do similar things. So I think it can be useful as a management tool in lots of ways, but in some cases it can also be careful what you wish for, as Emmanuel Faber found to some degree. What do you think, Karim?
Yeah, I think that, these are live issues, as you've noted, that are happening now. I think one of the upsides of having a conversation around monetary value is at least forces a different range of people to answer the question in ways that they normally wouldn't necessarily address. And I think that can be helpful. As we've seen from the experience of SROI, the downside is if that is the only way that the reverting to, for example, monetary values as a proxy for social issues that perhaps are multidimensional and complex, without the context within which that value creation is occurring, that's a bit of the challenge right now, in that if you prioritize some kinds of data over others and use that to inform certain kinds of calculations over others, you begin to see the unintended consequences of the broader monetization agenda. But hopefully we've learned some of those lessons from the first 10 or 15 years of doing this. I would just say final comment is, though that doesn't always seem to be the case. We've seen even in the last few years where new frameworks and tools are being developed around monetization and the kind of trade-off questions that really don't account for where we've gotten it wrong, or at least only partially right 10 years ago. So those would be just some additional comments. And just very quickly on the Danone example, it's interesting that the questions around measurement, strategy, and governance should be much more closely linked than they seem to be in practice. And I think that's a really good example of where perhaps we need to pay more attention to. We've got a couple of other questions. One from Alex around, are there measures of typical costs of collecting impact data versus traditional accounting data, and efforts to bring this down? I would say that some of the things that I talked about on the various forms of technology and how they're being applied are precisely to get at that, particularly within corporate supply chains. So on one hand, I think it's acknowledging that you can collect these types of data relatively cost efficiently. The other is just acknowledging that these types of data matter. And so they shouldn't be optional or additive. They should just be a part of doing business. And if we see the various forms of demand, of growing demand, whether it's from customers, corporates, intermediaries within supply chains, even regulators, that will no longer be an optionality question. Should we collect this data? But really, how are we using this data? In what ways will it influence our decision making? Because the costs are coming down quite tremendously. The bigger question is how much data and what combination really matters. So what's material for us? Alex, on that question or any of the others that have come in, anything?
Yeah, let me jump in on a few if I can, because I think I can cluster a few a little bit. Forgive me, everybody, if these are cursory responses, but they're great questions. So Dan's question is about passive asset managers and should they be trying to influence companies' behavior? Well, I think almost by definition they can't. So I mean, that's the fiduciary duty is not to do that by definition. So whether they want to become active asset managers is a different question. But if they're simply following the indices and tracking, then they're not in the business of trying to influence corporate behavior at all. I mean, normatively, should they? Well, maybe, but I don't think they're allowed to, although that would involve changing their mandate probably. Abu Bakr says, is Side Business School thinking about offering an online graduate program on impact measurement? Not currently. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could? At the moment, we only offer these executive education programs, but who knows, at some point in the future, maybe we will, but it's not immediately likely to happen, sadly, in my view. I think there's a lot we could do in this area. Bruno, the grief, a couple of questions from Bruno. He talks about how serious are investors and asset managers in terms of ESG. Well, it depends what you mean by serious. When you look at the data, and I did a report for the Asian Development Bank about this just before Christmas, I mean, ESG investing, as you probably know, might be anything up to half of all assets under management. It's 50 trillion, it's a lot of dollars. When you dig into it, almost all of it is negative screening. So it's simply saying, let's take out a few bad guys. Very little of it is positive investment for additional impact, if you like. So I'm not sure that would be fair. It'd be fair to say it's greenwashing, but it's certainly the vast majority is having limited impact, let's put it that way, other than to some degree punishing poor performing corporations by ESG measures. And even then, it's when you look at the top ESG companies, you wouldn't immediately think they're the most progressive companies necessarily. Also from Bruno, new EU regulation. Yes, you're right that the slide I showed represents a couple of years ago consultations and initial regulation came in. I don't know the detail of what's happening this year, but I know something new is happening around this. Maybe Karim knows more in terms of, I think, maybe beefing up or taking forward that EU regulatory agenda. So there was a discussion, there was some consultation, and then something new is indeed happening in 2021. I'm not sure I've seen the detail of exactly what that is, unless Karim has.
I'll just say that there's still more specificity required on certain parts of how this rolls out, and particularly around the social elements. So that will be a big set of issues to unpack that hasn't yet. Comparatively in the environmental and sustainability sides of things, it's been much more clear around the different shades of green, for example. And when we think about how that applies on the social side, a lot more work to be done there. So that's at least one thing, but much more to say on all of that.
So
Alex,
Paola's question, then I'll let you answer, just because it's there about government. So Paola Fonseca, thank you for your question. You asked the question, are there any governments choosing to use any of the impact measurement systems in government policy making? And the answer to my knowledge is no, but the way to flip it is that public policy, broadly speaking, historically has been informed by cost benefit analyses, and this is not new. I mean, welfare economics and public accounting economics, 50, 60 years old, and it's the basic way governments determine how they deploy money, public money, which of course is always limited, is to try to do some kind of cost benefit analysis. What is the cost of a program or a policy against this impact, at least some of which will be somehow kind of monetized social impact, like education, health, or whatever. So those are already on the kind of the books of how government accounting happens in most countries. And of course, the big change in that has been a move away from outputs to outcomes. So a lot of, particularly in this country, but elsewhere, the United States and other places too, are no longer commissioning for outputs, how many people go through a program, but outcomes, what are the effects of that program on that population, which of course is much more meaningful in terms of impact. So, I mean, there is a strong tradition of public accounting that uses proxies for impact measurement in CBA models, but this switch from outputs to outcomes, I think, is another innovation which is getting closer to impact.
Great, thanks, Alex. And there are a lot of questions. I'm going to pick up on a few that came in earlier, and we'll try and see how far we get with those. So Marina and Ian, and as well as a couple of others, asked us questions about additionality. So how do we think about additionality across public or private markets? In particular, as we think about public markets, we answered some of this during our presentations, but I would say that there is some nuance now around how particularly impact investors, but also perhaps ESG investors are beginning to think about what impact looks like in public markets. So a number of considerations for this. One is obviously the kinds of capital you bring and how significant your role is, the kind of combination of financial and non-financial contributions. So to what extent you're engaging in shareholder kind of activities and what the breadth and depth of that looks like, whether you do that alone or in collaboration. One of the other questions that had come in was around, can you measure that? The answer is yes. Are there best practices? I would say there are emerging practices. And one of the downsides perhaps is that the number of times you might engage, the kind of proxy measures we tend to see and use now don't necessarily correlate with how influential that engagement is or whether it actually shifted any of the outcomes. That said, that is beginning to change. Many sophisticated investors are coming together to at least think about more targeted activities and interventions and providing a different layer of transparency and accountability for companies to move. So I think that there are changes in the way that these measures are going to be constructed. And obviously one important dimension is the temporal one. If you are only holding companies for 2 or 3 years and you're in the business of influencing or generating impact, perhaps that's too short. And so maybe the broader agenda around long-term holdings might be an important consideration as you think about how this plays out in practice. Mabinti asked a couple of questions around how do we think about tracking unintended or negative impacts, and why is the impact investment industry in particular perhaps not necessarily vocal or perhaps somewhat reluctant to do that? I think the short answer is that the industry is just beginning to develop ways of thinking about this in a way that transcends some of the broader challenges of getting this information. So it's very hard to sometimes get information around what's happening if that wasn't part of your goal. If you're not listening to your stakeholders or not deliberately collecting kind of information, you won't see it. And the incentives in many of these structures are to actually not make it material or visible, even if you're in the business of creating impact. Again, that is beginning to change, both driven by better access to data through technology, more visible efforts at engaging with stakeholders to be able to understand a wider range of stakeholder interpretations of what impact looks like for them. Perhaps different mechanisms around what impact verification will ultimately look like, so that beneficiary and stakeholder perspectives are more deliberately included in those in a more formal sense, rather than in an advisory or support sense, as tends to be the case today. And then regulation. Regulation is probably going to force a degree of visibility to many of these issues around negative or unintended effects in the way that perhaps we've only gone halfway with sector-specific regulation or with ESG. So I think there's a number of changes that will prompt more of those questions. And if I were to hope we see that impact investors take the lead on some of this, and just as a heads up, you will see that some of the kind of prominent groups in the space, the GIN, Pacific Community Ventures, are beginning to come out and will be coming out shortly with more guidance on particularly these issues around impact risk and negative impacts. Alex, over to you. Maybe pick up a few.
I cluster a few questions. Spencer, Sheila, Karen, a couple of others. Really questions about, I guess, the transaction costs and how that balances against the robustness of these methods and data. In other words, on one hand, does everybody have to do a randomized control trial or whatever? On the other hand, does you do nothing? And of course, the answer is it's a massive spectrum between both. And partly that will depend on obviously your resources and the size of the organization, but also what the purpose of the process of impact measurement actually is. Because in the end, it should be about managing your organization. If you claim to be an organization that cares about any sort of impact, you can't legitimately make that claim if you make no effort to measure it. Now, the truth is that measure could be pretty rough and ready and pretty crude, but it should be something. And I think in the absence of anything, how do you have any idea if you're not completely wasting your resources and not achieving any impact at all? So it could be, and when you look at this, in a kind of model that moves from outputs to outcomes and impact, this kind of logic model or theory of change model you've sometimes seen, many of you. And for some organizations that have small resources, or for whom the prospect of major evaluation is an impossibility, then you have to choose what it is you can efficiently measure that's low cost for you or appropriate, and do the best you can. But doing anything is better than doing nothing. But what you do, you should do as well as you should, and you should do it in a comparable way. So do it the same way regularly. Otherwise, you can't track any improvements or deterioration in your performance. But the truth is, you don't have to do RCTs. You don't have to do SROIs. It depends on your resources and what your needs are, but you have to do something to claim you're any kind of impact organization. And finally, it'll depend on the audience. Because some of this stuff you have to do for funders. If you want outside investors or grants or other kind of funding, then they will require you to do some of this stuff. And then the grown-up conversation is, you have to put that in the financial package we agree in terms of your investment. You have to cover some of those costs because it'll be costly. Now, that's not always easy to do, but we need to have that grown-up conversation much more often with funders. We need to be able to say, you want us to do this additional reporting, you're going to have to pay for it. Otherwise, we can't do it. It's a hard conversation to have. We should have it. So don't over stress on making everything perfect, but try not to do nothing.
Great, thanks, Alex. So just to pick up on a few more questions, we've got some questions on the barriers to impact measurement, as well as the different standards and tools. Marta said rightly, there are so many models. How do we move away from some of the basics? We've covered a bunch of these in other webinars. We'll share those links with you in the follow-up, as well as shortly in the chat. There are ways of looking at how you understand what's the right combination of approaches for you. And as I described earlier, part of how we run the program is one of the themes is ask the right questions in the right order, starting with your whys to understand why are you measuring, who are the different users of information, how would you use information to make different decisions or to confirm or validate the existing decisions. There's a set of questions around that before you get into what gets measured and how. And as we've already discussed, that the questions around who's doing the measuring and when you measure also should influence your choice of approaches. The challenge we find still is that people ask these questions in the wrong order. They start with how and then realize that there are limitations to how they can use information for decision-making in the way that's applicable to their context. So I think that the short answer is ask the right questions in the right order, think deliberately around what your assumptions are and how you can make them visible, and recognize that you can't capture all the information typically, but that you can bring more visibility to information and your assumptions in a way that allows you to think about the decision-making implications. So I'll share some links to a couple of documents that provide a bit more content on this, as well as our webinars. Alex, other issues that have come up really are picking up on things we've talked a little bit about in terms of monetization, a little bit more, how we think about alignment with the SDGs, some of those kinds of challenges as well around how rigorous do we have to be around impact. Anything additional to add on any of those kinds of issues or any of the others?
I've just been typing a few answers as well, so I'm just going through what we have here. Well, there's an interesting question from Pedro. Can you give real examples of relevant consequences of good and bad results under impact measurement tools? So I think I think if I understand what Pedro is saying there, he means, what actually is either the managerial effects of these tools or the external effects. I'm not sure if I'm paraphrasing him properly there. And I don't know what you think, Karim. I think we're still at an early phase of this kind of question me being able to answer this with a strong answer, because absent these kind of this sort of standardization and the monetization processes being in place, external actors are struggling to make judgments on impact because they can't compare easily. So the most advanced in this space, of course, is carbon and environmental reporting. In this space, the kind of measurements around carbon footprints and impacts are beginning to have an effect on the way money moves, and external actors view companies, not just investors, but customers, employees, and other people too. That seems to be having a significant impact. I'm not sure the other tools that are out there are necessarily having that kind of impact, but they might have managerial, they might well help individual organizations perform better in terms of impact. What do you think, Karim?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a better answer at the moment. I think one challenge I found is that there are a lot of different tools and frameworks that don't necessarily yet do a good job in acknowledging what we've seen over the last year, that these kinds of different effects are related, in that you have very good sector-specific and thematic tools and frameworks, particularly in climate, but also in certain kinds of social domains. But the relationship between how those are connected and then the governance and strategy implications, this is where there's a big gap. But I would say that in a thematic sense, we're going to have much more sophisticated guidance and everything from impact investors to sustainability and beyond. I would say that increasingly on certain kinds of issue areas where there are strong relationships, we're going to begin to see a bit more happening around materiality and the patterns between them. But then the kind of holistic model around how they all tie together is still perhaps a bit elusive. But this, in some ways, is a really great challenge for us collectively to solve over the next few years, because in some ways, we're not just trying to get better reporting frameworks, we're really trying to get different forms of how we account, measure, and value in the broadest sense. We are almost at time, and see we still have more questions coming in. Alex, any final remarks? And then we'll hand it over to Annabelle to kind of close out. I would just say that we will direct you to some of our previous webinars. The number of questions we have and the type of questions have been great. Maybe we'll actually just do another webinar to respond to all of your questions, because there've been a lot of good ones. So thank you for that. But Alex, over to you for any final remarks, and then Annabelle to close us out.
Thank you. I mean, only just to reinforce Karim's commentary, really, which is it's an incredibly rich set of questions that show just how many important issues there are in this field still to be resolved. I think actually, I hope our answers have given some guidance. What I would say on the flip side is many of the very important issues you mentioned are in the process of being addressed. I mean, they're not, nothing you've said, I don't mean this disrespectfully, nothing you've said isn't something we're aware of being an issue, broadly speaking. So I think in all the things you've mentioned, progress is being made pretty much. But as I say, we are, to go back to an earlier comment, pretty much in the 19, 20, 25 stage of financial reporting now and impact reporting. It seems like a very busy space. It might very suddenly become a lot clearer quite quickly. And then some of these questions will be easier to answer. Annabelle.
Super. Thanks so much, Alex. And thanks to everyone for taking the time out of their day to attend the webinar. It's actually lovely to see so many familiar names on the participant list. So for those of you who've met in person, and for those who I know I've been in contact with over the last few years, really hope you're all staying well and staying sane under the current circumstances. We will email you within the next week with a recording of the webinar, as well as helpful links to some of the topics that have been covered. If you would like any more information on the programme, either impact measurement or another one of the impact programmes, please drop me an email directly. Equally, if you are not on our mailing list and you would like to be added so you can stay up to date with any new content that we're sharing, again, please drop me a line, and very, very happy to help you there. But thanks again. It was great to see everyone, and thank you, Karim and Alex, for a great session. And we will catch you next month for another of these sessions. Thanks so much.